Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about these swords right here. This is the Kaizen and the Hokusai from Mini-Katana, and these are part of their Tameshigiri series, which were sent to me recently for the purposes of review, though no, I didn't spend any money on them. They are review samples. If you think that makes me biased, you know at the start. And you should also know that I do study Japanese-style swordsmanship, and I've talked about swords on the internet for a long time, but I do still fancy myself a novice, or at least not an authority figure in the subject matter, so keep my musings and ramblings with that context in mind. The other thing you should keep in mind for context is that I don't think you can buy these swords right now. At least they show as sold out on the website currently, and I don't know if more will be coming. But if Mini-Katana releases other things in their Tameshigiri line, then hopefully this video is at least somewhat close to whatever comes next. And I hope there is a next, because these are foreshadowing here, you know, pretty cool. Anyway, the swords are $900 and $1,000 respectively. $900 for the Kaizen, $1,000 for the Hokusai, and depending on when you get them, they could be more or less, whether they become available or not. Again, if they're available, it's possible you could buy them on sale and they'd be less, and if something new comes out, inflation has been problematic, so it's possible they could be more. But anyway, I digress. These, in my mind, are going against other swords in the $900 to $1,000 range as I review and think about if they're worth it or not, or what kind of value they present. All right, so I'm going to go over the bits and bobs and fits and features, and I'm going to talk a little bit more than I typically do about what I'm looking for and why I'm looking for it, and hopefully you find it helpful. I know some of the folks tuning into this might be from Mini-Katana's channel, and maybe I do things a little bit differently, so I thought it might be helpful to be a little bit more wordy than I typically am. If you don't happen to like that, then, well, I'm sorry in advance. I'm pretty long-winded. But anyway, I'm going to review both of these at the same time. They're more similar than they are different, and I'm doing both swords in one video here. So the Kaizen model right here, we have a black kashra. On the Hokusai, we have kind of a gold detailed kashra on the end cap. The kashra, incidentally, is this end cap here, the pommel, though it's not really a pommel or a weight, it's just a cap that goes over the end. It serves a purpose as well. So the construction of these handles is two slats of wood that have a cutout area for the tang to rest over. Then they could be wrapped in samegawa. These have a panel of samegawa, so that's not adding any kind of structural integrity. There's a pin that goes through to provide a mechanical connection that runs through a hole in the tang of the blade, and then this is wrapped in some sort of silk. It can be leather, it can be a number of other substances that hold the handle down. And then this kashra, the end cap here, is a cap that goes over the top of it. It holds the ends down, and this fuchi up here holds the ends down as well. So there's like another kind of mechanical hold to keep the scales of wood, in case the glue or adhesive fails, from splitting apart and causing a failure in the handle. Anyway, it does offer some mechanical function, but it's also quite pretty. And when I talk about prettiness, I talk about casting quality often. So historically, Japanese fittings, well, some of them were cast. Very often they were hammered out and chiseled out, and it's called painting with the iron brush. And so little files were used to make very detailed and ornate patterns in these things. And how closely the casting quality of the manufacturer replicates or represents what they're trying to emulate is something that I often harp on quite a bit. So I would say these are not bad. In terms of overall fitting quality, generally they're not bad. The casting quality could be crisper, but I can make out the floral patterns. I can make out what they're supposed to be. I can make out what's supposed to be nanako. That's this it's like a fine punch that leaves a little dot, and they were often done by hand very painstakingly, and I can see something that's trying to recreate very small nanako in the handle under the floral pattern. I can see that it's there. It's not as great as the real thing, but I can see that it's there, and it's not just kind of lost to the repetitions of casting. The Kaizen, the more expensive model, has or the Hokusai, I'm sorry, the more expensive model has gold embellishments. I often see these kind of look, I describe them as finger painted. This one isn't actually too bad. The detailing in gold is reasonably well applied, and so it doesn't cross over the lines like a child finger painting with gold paint. At the same time, I tend to think this looks a little bit muddy. It's not as well applied as what it's trying to emulate. At the same time, it does add a little bit of pizzazz. Maybe you happen to like it, but I actually prefer the Kaizen model over the Hokusai model in terms of fittings. Though either one is 6 1/2 dozen of the other kind of for me. In terms of other things I look at around them, I look at this transition here. So from the kashra to the ito, how does it line up? And ideally, it looks like this. I can't make out any material or wood or anything like that, and the ito runs right up to the kashra, but doesn't overlap. And that's a tough thing to do. The wrapping typically starts up at the top here, and then they have to go down all the way to the kashra, and they have to build all these pieces before they start. So you have to know how thick the Ito is going to be when you stretch it out, and that can mean that it's really easy to have overlap or have space where you don't want it, and then it doesn't look the way that it's supposed to. So to have it line up perfectly is not an easy thing to do, and both of these do. So good job. This is a thing that is very often missed on swords much more expensive. You can spend a couple $1,000s on a sword and still have Ito that has bad transitions here. The other thing I tend to look at is the knot. It's not something I harp on a lot, but ideally they're even and you don't see giant unsightly bulges on either side. So no one would want unsightly bulges from their knots, right? So the handle, the core, usually has some sort of carving in it where the knots can rest and be recessed slightly so they line up with the rest of the Ito. And I would say the knots stick out a little bit, but not a lot, which means some attempt has been made to keep the size of them reduced. The next thing I look at is I move up from the kasha and look at just the handle. And one very important factor here is the tightness of the Ito. So ideally, I could take all of my big fat body weight and stand on one of these knots and it wouldn't move around at all. That is the gold standard and very rarely achieved on any sword, let alone one in the $1,000 price point, or really very, very few reproduction swords out there. What I'll settle for is displacing like maybe a millimeter or two under a fair amount of pressure. And I would say that these are pretty tight and get an above average score, but I can move them around if I push on them. The knots do move slightly, though not a lot, and I would say that this is more than acceptable in the price point. The Hasoka is a little bit tighter than the Kaizen one. I think that might just be happenstance, not because it's more expensive, but I can't move the knots around a whole lot. And both of them give me some level of confidence that they're not going to come undone. And I've used both of these handles quite a bit over the last month or so that I've had these swords. I've practiced with them a fair amount, particularly over the holidays, and I haven't noticed them loosening or tightening. Sometimes they get tighter as they fill with oil from your hands and such. But anyway, I can move one around a little bit, the other a little bit less. Either way, I think they get an above average score. The next bit that I look at is the general shape. So the Kaizen has a little bit more wasting than the Hasokai model does. Either way, they are reasonably narrow. They don't feel like big axe handles. Sometimes the handles can be too round or too wide, and they don't really feel elegant or easy to hold on to in the hand. Both of these have a pretty solid shape to them. The next thing I look at is the samega. This white stuff under here is raised skin, and it's like a rawhide. It's not tanned like leather typically is, so it's pretty coarse. And sometimes the raised skin is wrapped all the way around the handle. It provides some additional structural integrity. In this case, though, it's done in panels, and so these panels are visible. If I take the little cap off here, I can see that they're done in panels, and they run down the length of the blade here, or the length of the handle. Now, if they're done in panels, what I look for is to make sure I don't see the wood on either side of the diamonds. And so when these knots are done in this kind of diamond pattern, sometimes they move or jut out in such a way where I can make out the core of the wood, and that's not something you're supposed to see. And fortunately, I don't. I can't make out any wood corners on any of these diamonds. The next bit I look at is the shape of the diamonds and how consistent they are. So they should all be about the same size, and they should all be in the same line, and they shouldn't kind of wander up and down and jut around throughout the course of the wrap here. They should be pretty consistent in a central line, and the corners should all line up reasonably well, and they should generally look the same size and not wander. And I would say for the most part they do. It's not perfection. This could certainly be a little bit cleaner, but it's far and away above average, because a lot of times, even on swords that are $1,000 or $2,000, they wander around and kind of bounce up and down like they're playing a game of Tetris or something like that. And that's not the case here. Generally, they look pretty clean. So overall, I would say the handle, thus far anyway, is feeling pretty good. It feels secure, and it's getting a lot of the little details right. Move up to the Fuchi here, and again, I'm looking for some of the same transitions that I see on the Kashra. They shouldn't overlap, they shouldn't jut out, and I'm not seeing them do any of those things here. The last bit that I look for on the core, or at least the last bit for now, is I look at the handle core and I look for cracks. And so I take the Kashra off, I inspect the wood, and I look for anything that's cracked. Now you're going to see cracks because, well, there's seams that are glued together, and so you'll see where they're adhered together. That's normal, but you shouldn't be seeing any really, really large cracks outside of where the seams are. That's a sign that they took the handle, hammered it on, it didn't fit, and rather than fix it or file the tang, they just percussively maintenanced it on. And I don't see that happening in either one of these. Generally, they look pretty clean. And I also see that some shims have been placed on, which is far and away a better way of doing it than just hammering it on when it doesn't fit. So generally speaking, the handles, at least thus far, I would say are well and above average for what I typically see in swords of this price point. It's not to say they don't have opportunities for improvement, but generally speaking, I would say they're doing a pretty solid job. The next part I talk about is the Tsuba, and that's the guard here. Now, the Tsuba can be a lot of different things. These happen to be Tsukashi style Tsuba, or kind of cutout Tsuba done in iron or some sort of metallic metal that has a patina on it. And stylistically, I think they're okay, but they do just basically look like flat pieces of metal that have cutouts. And so there's some opportunity to have more dimension here, more three-dimensionality, rather than a flat plane that's been cut out. At the same time, very often, again, even at $1,000, people just have muddy recast fittings that look like they're finger painted. And so this is, while it's very simple, it's also doing the job pretty well. The cutouts look reasonably well done. They're made out of a nice metal. The patina is not a paint that appears to be chipping. And overall, they're light and nice looking things, and not ahistoric either. So I think the Tsuba are fine for what they are, but I do think there's an opportunity to do something a little zazzier on here than what I'm seeing with a simple flat cutout. And if the metal had a little bit more dimension, rounded a little bit, had a little bit more file work on it, doesn't have to have a lot, but I think it would add a little touch of class here that I'm not seeing presently. The next bit I'm going to talk about is the Nakago, the handle here, and more or less what I see on the Nakago is a reasonably clean Nakago. So there's not a lot of file markings on here, and I have seen swords for less money that have more elaborate Nakago. So underneath, when you take the handle off, which I should incidentally note came off reasonably easily, there's one Makugi peg, it came off, and I was able to remove it like you would on a traditional Japanese sword. But the Nakago often will have file markings on it. I don't see any file markings here. There's some writing, but no signatures or anything carved in from like the smith signing his work or anything like that. At the same time, the shape is reasonably well done. It has dimensionality. It doesn't have jutting sharp edges. Some attention to detail has been done on this Nakago, but not so much that it kind of is a showpiece itself. And traditionally speaking, you would take this off and often see some elaborate file work done by the smith. Not necessarily elaborate, but enough to maybe identify who did it. And there's some level of attention to detail on the filing on the Nakago, and then some signature, which is fun to see. Now, a lot of people are never going to take their sword apart, so why invest any time in doing this is often a question a manufacturer has to wrangle with. And so seeing even this level of attention is reassuring, means that they made it pretty under the hood as well, and I appreciate that. But more could be done here, but I think they've certainly done more than a lot of folks do. At the same time, I have seen some pieces from Hanwei, from Huawei, and a few other manufacturers that do a little better job in zazzing up the Nakago. One other thing I would note as well, and this is the little hole here, a lot of times, again, nobody ever takes it apart, so they just take a drill and zip through the hole and never clean it up, and there's sharp little metal jagged bits that are sticking out as a result. This Nakago Ana, the Makugi Ana, I should say, sorry, is addressed. So it's been cleaned up and drilled out just a little bit so that it has a chamfered edge so that there's not sharp little metal bits poking out of it, which again, some level of attention to detail here on a part that most people are never going to see. The next part I'm going to talk about is the Habaki, and both models have very similar Habaki, so I'm just going to focus on one. They're both copper, they both seem to be made the same way and both fit just as well. But I'm going to go into detail on one because there's a few things to unpack. Now, in terms of shape, there are slight ledges that ride up. It's not straight down, so shape-wise it's narrow but good and has the proper dimensionality to it, or at least better than I typically see. The Habaki is touching the blade. I don't ideally like to see it touch the blade, but some people do. And on the spine here, there's an attempt at little feet that are riding over behind the mune so that the mune isn't jutting out. That's the back of the sword, the spine of the sword. And the Habaki should kind of like ride over the back edge of the Habaki so that the Habaki is touching the scabbard and not the blade itself. And so I do see some attempt here where at least the mune is not sticking out over the Habaki, which is not uncommon, and it's also not flush. The Habaki is sticking out a little bit more, and that is correct. And also, if I drop the Habaki down, one thing that I see in here is a little shelf. So underneath or inside this habaki, there's a little welded bar, and it's not something that is typically seen, not something that you necessarily have to care too much about, but that little piece rests on this little notch right here. This is called the hamachi, and it's the spot where the blade juts out, and this little bar is where that hamachi rests. So oftentimes you'll see habaki made where the hamachi just rests on a shoulder here, and they don't really have the inner part of the habaki made, at least not in the traditional sense. And this one does, which is a neat thing to see. This is a reasonably well made habaki, and something I don't beyond what I typically expect to see on even $1,000 sword. It's often missed on swords much more expensive than that. The other bit to note is that the hamachi and mumachi are on the same plane. Oftentimes I see them not on the same level, and that's not necessarily ahistoric, but most examples of Japanese swords that I've seen in Nihonto tend to have the hamachi and mumachi on the same level. It's not that it can't be done a different way, but it's usually or typically done on the same plane. The next bit to talk about is how the habaki fits in the scabbard, and both of these habaki fit the way that they're supposed to. They both tension correctly, so if I'm drawing and sheathing, basically it fits in. There's a slight amount of pressure to kind of give a friction fit on the habaki. I can turn the sword upside down, it doesn't fall out, so if I bend over to pick up a piece of candy I found on the ground, then, well, it's not going to fall out and cut me, or I'm not going to have to reach and grab it and, fight my reaction to grab the falling thing. On top of that, it also unsheathes correctly. It's not tensioned too tight so that I can't get the sword out or really have to pull. That can also be very dangerous, and these are tensioned correctly. And I'd imagine they came from a very different climate than mine is, and I'm in a very cold and dry climate at the moment, and I'm practicing outside in the cold weather with these, and the tension has been very consistent. So whatever wood they're using has been stabilized so that it's not varying quite a bit with the various changes in temperature and humidity. Now, the next bit I'm going to talk about is the scabbard, and both of these have very, very similar scabbards, so I'm going to just talk a bit about both of them. So one has an ishime kind of polish with a kind of red base and little speckles of black. The other is black, and it's a little bit more satin in terms of color. The scabbards have some slight taper to them, so they thin out down towards the end. This is also not something that you typically see. Very often, scabbards tend to have one thick tube, and they have very little profile taper in them. But both of these scabbards do have some element of taper to them. There is a horn piece at the end, or some kind of piece. I don't know if it's horn, but some sort of kojiri at the end. This is a piece here. Now, ideally, you want some sort of thing there beyond just the wood and the paint. There's a lot of techniques in Japanese style swords where you're using them sitting down, and if you move the scabbard around while it's sitting in your belt, it can bop on the floor, and wood and paint chip very easily, but these horn bits tend to hold up a little bit better. You're not supposed to use your sword as a cane, but if you set it on the ground, then you're also less likely to get moisture and stuff in the scabbard. So something here to protect the end is typically appreciated, and I'm not sure if this is horn, but it is definitely something that is beyond wood and paint. The koiguchi here feels like painted wood, or I'm sorry, not koiguchi, kurigata. This is the little nub that sticks out of the scabbard that the sageo attaches to. And this feels like it's made of wood. This seems like a missed opportunity here. So on a $800 or $1,000 sword respectively, having these pieces made of horn or some sort of metal fitting is not expected but appreciated, and wood is cheaper. It's a way to save a buck, and if you're going to save a buck, honestly, that's not necessarily a bad place to do it, because I don't know how many people really care, but horn fittings are nice to see here. The shirodome, these little washers, are actually fit in here, pressure fit, and they didn't come out particularly easily while I was using it. That's appreciated, but they are not glued in. It came with a sageo. Both came with about the same quality of sageo, I would say. It's not a bad level of sageo, but it's also not particularly special. Oftentimes in the $1,000 sword range, there are some manufacturers that offer a somewhat bespoke sageo in here, where you have some elaborate pattern that you would only find on this particular sword. And it may be an opportunity for Mini-Katana to be creative and have some kind of custom made sageo put on that are only on their swords versus things that you tend to see or that are a little bit more plain. Moving up here, you have the koiguchi, the mouth of the scabbard, and this is made with what looks like some sort of resin or something kind of rim, but it's a cheaper way of going about it. And horn, again, would be appreciated here. It's a little bit more expensive to do, more than likely, but would be appreciated. This is what I typically see on scabbards that are much less expensive than $1,000 sword. So this is not typically up to the level of a sword at the $1,000 price point, but a cheaper way to make the scabbard. There's something there beyond just putting wood on it. When you're drawing the sword, if you move the scabbard and kind of pull it down, it's very easy to split it here and have the sword cut through the scabbard and into the meat of your hands, which is not fun. So something to provide a little extra structural integrity here is appreciated, though I like to see it done with horn, and I like to see it done in a more traditional way. The other bit to note is the placement of the kurigata. This happens to wander around a lot with manufacturers, and it's supposed to be about 4 fingers, and this one happens to be in about the right spot. Sometimes they bounce around or do one is further up or down. This is in the right spot. This is assuming that you're using this for traditional Japanese swordsmanship practice, or that it's supposed to fit in the place where a traditional katana would be. If it sits in your belt, you can kind of feel where this is, and if it's too high or too low, then it sticks out of your belt in sometimes in strange ways, or doesn't fall back enough for you to do some sayabiki or moving the scabbard in your belt techniques well enough. Anyway, so it's in the right spot, so good on you. So the scabbards seem like there is some cost cutting involved here. It's not at the typical level that I would see a $1,000 scabbard. It has all the things where it matters though. So the paint is nice, it has a nice profile, it's light and it draws well, but it's basically lacking horn parts, and that's typically something I would see in a sword in the $1,000 price point. It's not a guarantee, but it is something I would typically find in a sword at that price. Alright, sword friends, I'm going to talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part, and more or less I'm holding one sword, the Kaizen, right now, but I could basically anything positive or negative I have to say applies to both swords, and the only difference I can really make out that's meaningful is that one is folded and one is not. But all of the pros and cons that exist on one, and the shape and size and all of that, are pretty much the same, which I guess there are some technical differences. If you're interested in those, they're listed in the description down below. There are some measurements there that call out what subtle differences there are between the two. Anyway, pros, they have beautiful polishes, and that extends beyond just looking at them and being able to see this hamon. That's the differentially hardened line that you typically see on a katana. So I can make that out, but I can make it out in any light, and this really is an exemplary polish. You often see some kind of hodgepodgey different takes on polishing out of swords in China, and this is a little bit more Japanese than I'm used to seeing, and it's becoming more common, but it's still not something you can take for granted in the reproduction sword that you're getting. But I see the hamon, I see it in detail, and there are a lot of metallurgical details that are brought out in the polish that are really easy to appreciate. Now, the Kaizen is a mono steel, or a single type of steel, but I can make out some banding effects in the surface of the steel, even though there's no hada in a traditional sense, no wood grain pattern that you might see on some traditional Japanese style swords. Now, the Hokusai model does have folding, and that pattern is present, and I can make out both the hamon, which is a little bit more erratic, has a little bit more character to it, as well as the hada, the wood grain pattern on the surface of the steel. It's also brought out really, really well. It has character. It's fun to look at. There's a slight bit of rust on the Hokusai model that I got. It wiped off with the application of oil, and I never saw it again. But other bits to note about the polish: the surface is very clean. So as I look along the surface, it looks smooth as glass, and sometimes you'll see rippling along the surface. None of that is present here. Sometimes you'll also see wavers on the lines of the sword. So either on the spine, on the shinogi, they will wander around a little bit, and these are all really quite crisp and clean. The polishes also have more or less a mirror spine, and then the blade is slightly more opaque. And then the Kisaki also has some, well, it doesn't look like it's just simply polished the other direction, or that it's got tool marks or something on it. It looks like I can both make out where the yokote is, which does feel to be geometric. There's a shape that's in there, but it's also called out with the polish work that's been done on it, and it is has more or less a much more pretty Kisaki than I typically find. Very often you just see these kind of scratched different direction. Here there's even more opaque color to it, and it's got a lot more character to it than I would typically expect to see in a sword of $1,000. And that is true on the Hokusai model as well. Both of them have absolutely excellent polish, very clean lines, very nice. They also don't have bohi, so that would be a fuller. Neither one of them have that. They're both in the shinogi zakuri style geometry, which I guess I could describe as what you typically think of when you see a katana. So it's got a blade and then a Kisaki marked by Kasaki being a tip marked by the Yokote, this line here that designates where the tip is, and they have a spine that doesn't have any kind of cutaway back or anything like that. But I'll dispense with that. They're both in the same geometry. And they also came very, very sharp. So either one came exceptionally sharp, kind of hair shaving sharp. They both came out of the box that way, and they all held an edge reasonably well. So I'll talk about using it, but not only did they come sharp and pop pool noodles apart, I did notice a significant difference between either one of them that couldn't be pointed out as my technique, but they both cut pool noodles well, they cut bottles well, and did effectively the same performance on any material that I threw at them. I was also somewhat surprised, if I talk about the polish, at how well it held up. So typically I'll see scratches even from cutting pool noodles, and that's expected in especially elaborate polishes like this, and I didn't see a whole lot of degradation to the polish in the materials that I cut. There's certainly some I can see that I've cut with them now, but it wasn't as much as I would expect. It seems to be a reasonably scratch resistant steel that is used, whatever it happens to be. All right, sword friends, now it's time for me to talk about the usage side of things. And I practiced Eido with these swords quite a bit. And so I would tell you that they are effective and good training tools. They are not particularly heavy, so I can use them without becoming fatigued just from the weight standpoint. But they're also put together in a pretty nice way so that I don't feel like I have to white knuckle it. If the ito is loose, for example, I feel like I really have to hold on tight, then I become fatigued more quickly, and it's tougher for me to make it through a few hours of practice. These feel like reasonably well put together training tools, and they're also on the lighter side from a sword perspective, so they are fun to move from the Eido perspective as well. The scabbards as well are not raspy or anything, and they are tensioned right, so I can do quiet draws, and they're basically not fighting me as a training tool. So if you are looking at practicing with a sword as a live blade and you want to practice with one, but you don't want to buy a multi-$1,000 sword out of Japan, these are light and comfortable swords to use for EI. I did have a good amount of fun using them. The Tsukashi style Tsubas, my hands didn't get caught in them. Whenever I would choke up on the grip, I didn't find myself getting bit or anything like that. And again, just as Eido practice tools, both of them were very, very comfortable. The only thing I would complain about is that they have no reinforced kasaki and they don't have any fullering in them, so they're relatively quiet, which means I don't hear if I'm doing the technique correctly. If you cut the air with the sword, you can sometimes hear this swishy wind sound that the sword can make, and that is almost inaudible, at least to me. So other people can hear it in the dojo, but I can't hear it, and that means I can't tell if my edge alignment is good or if I'm doing my technique correctly. But if Mini-Katana were to, in the future, come out with examples that have slightly reinforced kasakis that sometimes can aid in the whistle tip, if you will, or fullering, the bohi that can come on Japanese style swords, then either one of those tend to make the sword more audible. It's not a bad thing that it's not audible. Very often swords that don't have a reinforced kasaki or a bohi tend to be on the quieter side, so it's not a surprise here. It's just a note as a practitioner that if you can't hear if you're doing it correctly, it's a hurdle to doing it correctly. All right, sword friends, I'm going to talk about cutting now, and more or less I cut the same materials in the same day with these swords. And so I cut pool noodles, water bottles, and tatami mats, at least. Well, I've cut more than that, but that's what I have on film for you. And I can tell you that effectively they act the same, and I wanted to do it the same materials in the same day so that I could compare and contrast them as evenly as possible, and effectively they tend to be the same. So I would say with the pool noodle, I had a little bit better time with the Hokusai model, but I would say that's more me than anything else. And if I look at the angles and whatnot and how it cut the pool noodle when I had a good angle, both of them seem about the same. Both of them feel like they have the same sharpness as well. When I cut into water bottles, I had very similar results. Both of them cut very well, very effectively. I didn't have any problems. They had similar levels of scratching left over from them as well, which was negligible. And I cut into the necks of water bottles as well, and I didn't find any edge deformation whatsoever. So it wouldn't be surprising, particularly on a cold day, that if I'm cutting into the neck of a water bottle, the plastic gets a lot thicker and it's easier to damage your sword. So seeing some edge deflection, some even chipping has happened to me in the past. Wouldn't be unexpected here. It'd be certainly disappointing, but at the same time, I've seen it happen in the past. None of that happened here. The swords survived and showed no edge damage from cutting in the necks of water bottle. The last thing that I cut with either one was used Japanese tatami, and I call it used Japanese tatami because it's a harder tatami to cut. Sometimes there are new mats. Those tend to cut a little bit easier. Used Japanese tatami is full of old foot oil and stuff, and That means that when I soak it, it can be harder. Now, there is some variation between the tatami. Sometimes they can be softer, sometimes they can be harder. I did try to find 2 tatami mats that felt very, very similar to one another. I'm also cutting when it's freezing outside, and so it's worth noting that I'm not letting one freeze. Both are sitting in kind of the keep warm tub, and that's why they're so wet, as well as I kind of have to keep them inside in a spot where there's a little bit of water so they don't dry out, but also so they don't freeze, and I'm not letting them get to very different temperatures or freeze while I do filming for one while the other sits. Anyway, both cut tatami exceptionally well. They sailed right through. I threw bad cuts at it, not intentionally, just because I'm bad at it, and the swords cut. They didn't bend. I didn't show any damage on the swords, and the swords would certainly bend. It wouldn't be surprising if they bent in cutting tatami poorly. And neither one did. They held their shape, and they also sailed through the targets really, really well. It was very easy to cut with, and I looked better cutting than I had any right to. So I would say that they cut tatami really, really quite well, which was surprising, because typically these lighter swords that I like using for EI tend to be a little less effective at cutting, and both of these seem to do the job quite well. The other bit that I should note I cut is some sticks, and I cut a few different varieties of sticks, and this is where it wasn't equal. So the Kaizen model, I cut a few different pine sticks, and these are not particularly hard things. They're white pine, and they were from recently cut branches, so they still have a lot of sap in them, still have a lot of moisture in them. And effectively, they cut really well. It wasn't a problem to cut. They left no scratches, they didn't bend the sword, there was no edge deformation. But on the Hokusai model, I cut a part of the branch that was really quite thick. It was from a pretty large branch that was taken down, and it cut really deeply through the branch, and it was very, very impressive and showed no edge damage whatsoever. So that one got a little bit of a harder punishment, and it surprised me actually in how effective a cutter it was and how little damage it showed. Now, that is the extent of the cutting that I'm showing here. Now, I'm not pushing them to failure. I know that's my typical shtick on YouTube, but I don't think somebody buying these swords is really has any chance of bringing them into battle, kind of thing. I don't think you're maybe morbidly curious about how they hold up to the croquet stake of doom, but I don't know that it's going to actually provide any help. And if I'm wrong on that, let me know. I'm willing to revisit and push these swords further if you genuinely are curious. But at the moment, I don't think it would be particularly helpful. So this is where I'm stopping the testing, is at the kind of debatably abusive side of normal usage, which would be cutting relatively thick branches. I want to say it was about a 2.5, maybe 3-inch diameter branch at the base that I cut, and to many, that would be abusive on a smaller, differentially hardened katana. But I'm going to stop there, and either way, I would just say at this point, I'm kind of impressed with how well they cut. They held up well, they cut well, and they showed very little damage as a result. Very even little scuffing on the polish. So that's what I could share about the usage side of things. And in fact, at this point, that's really as much useful information as I can share at all. I've showed all the close-ups and bits and bobs and fits and features. I've elaborated on why I think what I do and what I'm looking for. I've talked about using it as a practitioner, and I've talked about cutting with it as well. And so hopefully at this point, you have enough information to decide if these swords, should they become available again or something like them, is worth your hard-earned money. And to me, it's time to answer that question myself now. The short answer is yes, and it's a pretty easy yes for me too. I think you get actually a lot for your money here. The swords are really have a lot of attention to detail. There are some opportunities to put horn parts on or attend to this, that, or the other, but generally speaking, I think you get something that is more right than wrong, and that is something of a surprise for me. I wasn't expecting to see something as nice from Mini-Katana, and that's bias on my part, but I having a company that isn't specializing in really high-end swords, to have this be their first go-around with it and come this close or come this far with it is really quite impressive. I think they did a great job on these swords. The polish is beautiful. They move really elegantly. They're nice to use as practitioner tools. They cut very effectively. They seem to hold up really well. And while they're not inexpensive, if I compare them to other $1,000 swords that I've looked at, I mean, they certainly get more right than wrong. They have a level of attention to detail that puts them in the running for some of these really high-end companies. And if I compare it to, say, Zisei, a sword review sample that I had a while ago, the Zisei sword has a fuller. There's some differences between them, but fundamentally the Kaizen and the Zisei Toryuyan katana that I got are very, very similar products and basically the same price. The Hokusai, with a folded steel sword for $100 more, kind of paints that as an even more kind of value-centric item, because I would imagine folded steel sword from Zisei would probably cost a little bit more money. And in that sword, you get beautiful polish as well as a hara that has a lot of unique characteristics to it, a lot of metallurgical effects to appreciate. And I happen to think it's just a very charming and pretty sword. So yes, I do think they are worth it, but you do have to be a person that appreciates what they have on offer. So the things that I would say about the Zisei sword are basically what I would critique here. You have to appreciate the polish in order to pay for it, because fundamentally you're getting a sword that is a very similar balance and feel to perhaps other swords that are out there, but albeit at a higher level. The ito is nice and tight. There's a lot of little things that I went over in this video that are right and tight, and if those matter to you, you're paying a little bit more to have them attended to. And also the polish is very pretty, but you're not getting a profile that's a competitive cutter. It's not made out of some sort of super steel that you can go bash rocks with. It's going to diminish quickly if you are abusing it. And so if you are a person that values those other things, like if you want something to compete in Tameshigiri cutting competitions with, then a sword that has a profile more bespoke to that intent is probably going to perform better, and you're not going to hamstring yourself by using a sword that isn't of that profile. Likewise, if you're looking for a sword for the end of days that can't take damage, well, then these are not that. They're not made of any kind of steel that is going to do that. They're also differentially hardened, a little bit more traditional, and they're not going to hold up to abuse the same way that some other swords will on the market. So if you are a person that values those other things, then I don't think your money would be better spent on one of these. I think you should look for a product in that category. But I do think if you are a person that values what is on offer here, you sure do get a lot for your money. And I'm kind of surprised by that. I wasn't expecting it. Right out of the gate, Mini-Katana did a pretty solid job, and so I hope they offer these swords again, or I hope they offer another series like them, maybe with some of the improvements that I've noted in this video. Anyway, that is all the information that I have. Again, special thanks to the folks at Mini-Katana for sending these my way. They have been very fun to test, and I will probably continue to train with them a little bit because I do really enjoy them. Anyway, that's it. Again, cheers, and thanks for watching.